A little bit of moisture out there today. Water the flowers, I guess, because probably most of us all have our sprinkler systems off, so the flowers aren't getting much moisture, so we got to rely on the rain to do so. So that's why we're getting rain today, probably. All right, so we are continuing our study in Ecclesiastes, and we left off at verse 17 of chapter 2, and I thought I would maybe just back up couple of verses just so that we get our minds rethinking on where we were when we left off, and from that hopefully we'll be able to sort of catch up from where we were. So let's take a look at verse 15. Solomon speaking, of course, "Then I said to myself, as is the fate of the fool, it will also befall me. Why then have I been extremely wise? So I said to myself, this too is vanity. For there is no lasting remembrance of the wise man as with the fool. Inasmuch as in the coming days all will be forgotten, and how the wise man and the fool alike die. So I hated life, for the work which had been done under the sun was grievous to me, because everything is futility and striving after the wind." And so that verse is the verse we're going to pick up on, but once again, we just remind ourselves that we're dealing with a section of Scripture at the start of Ecclesiastes that's very depressing to most of us. It's a very negative view, and there's a reason for that, and we're going to see that this morning, because we're going to swap our thought process here pretty soon. So, at any event, before we begin, I've asked Dave if he would to offer our prayer this morning.
Our Lord and our Father in heaven, we thank you for this time you have given us that we can come and study your word and ask that you be with us and open our minds, that we can take that word with us wherever we go, and to show others that you do live in us and that we do want to praise and always to glorify you. We thank you for your Son and for what he's done for us and what he continues to do for us, and ask that he will always walk with us. In your Son's name we pray. Amen.
Man, thank you, Dave. Appreciate it. Forgot my clicker. Had some nice flowers from the funeral yesterday. It was really memorial service, I should say. It was really a nice service for those of you that were able to come. And we do have part of that on that we streamed, that you could get pieces of it if you wanted to actually go and watch and listen to our brother Paul, who gave a wonderful message. And so, speaking of Paul, we're looking forward tonight. Paul is going to be with us to deliver a message to the congregation. So we're looking forward to that, Paul, and it's great to have you. Okay, here we go. Chapter 2. Verse 17, everyone dies, whether he's a wise man or a fool. And that was Solomon's observation, and clearly a good observation. And that verse also brought to us that death brings an end to wisdom and makes life vain. If we think of verse 17, it sort of summarizes everything that we've been talking about up to this point through chapter 1 and 2. And basically Solomon is back to his old verbiage. Everything is futility. There's no real benefit to doing any of this stuff, to having all of this wisdom and having all of the things that I've accomplished and done. It's all futility. Striving after the wind is his verbiage. The only benefit, we saw this last week, that he shared was when he was actually doing the work. He found some benefit in doing that. And so we'll continue to pursue that thought later on today and then probably on future lessons as well. So, death brings... David, go ahead.
Controversial. Solomon, wise men are for them. Wise men are always wise men. Wise men
Very true. And David says that we do have people that we do remember that were wise men in their particular time, past presidents, and folks like that, some scholars even you could put in that category, and there is some remembrance of them. Solomon would say, thank you, David, for offering that. It's all vanity. Because all those people are dealing with worldly things. They're not dealing with godly things, and that's where Solomon's pointing us to. And he's going to change his issue in a minute, but we got to get there first. But for the moment, we're not focused on anything about God. We're only focused on worldly things. So that's his thought process. So, life is about acquiring wisdom, but then death comes, he says. And so, why did I acquire all this wisdom? Because I'm just going to die. And the things that I have done, people are going to forget. And so all of those years should have been or could have been used perhaps while he was attaining wisdom at doing something else. And again, that something else is yet to come. So we'll be thinking about that. There's an old adage that I found, too soon we get old, and too late we get smart. And that's really true. Too soon we get old, and too late we get smart. So it takes us a long time to figure out life. And in our youth, we don't always do very smart things. And that's kind of Solomon's point. One scholar said it this way. Finally, he reaches the dreary destiny of every man who tries to live without God. Despair. I hated life. How many infidels and hedonists have there been who have wished they had never been born? A life lived without God under the sun, of course that's what we were talking about, is grievous, painful, empty, profitless, without God. So that's where Solomon, I think, is taking us. Let's look at verses 18 through 20. Thus, I hated all the fruit of my labor for which I had labored under the sun, for I must leave it to the man who will come after me. And who knows whether he will be a wise man or a fool? Yet he will have control over all the fruit of my labor for which I have labored by acting wisely under the sun. This too is vanity. Therefore I completely despaired of all the fruit of my labor for which I had labored under the sun. So in these verses, Solomon is, as we think about Solomon, through his life, and because he was king, he had the ability to accumulate lots of stuff. Lots of stuff. And a massive amount. And of course, an impressive estate, if you would, if you looked at it that way, because of who he was and the blessings that God had bestowed upon him and the ability for him to create and to build and have the resources to do that. So he created a massive amount of stuff. But he came to the realization that he was going to die, just like the fool was going to die. And so he asked the question, who's going to benefit from all of the work that I have done? So he says, I hated it. I hated all of the fruit of my labor. And the fruit here, of course, is referring about all of the things, all of the worldly things that he had created and built and obtained. So all of those things would be considered his fruit. And so as he's talking about that, he says that he hates life and its fruit, the things that he's done. Later on, when we get a little further into the book, we'll find out that he's going to change that, and he'll say that we need to enjoy life. Yeah, Bill. Absolutely. And we talked about I last week and how many times that he's used I, and all of the focus is on him. You know. Yeah, Bill says that if we look at life from the I standpoint as opposed to the we standpoint, that he would fall into Solomon's thought process of all of that is worthless. But if we do it collectively together, that there is much more profit in doing that. So thank you, Bill, for that. The fruit, of course, is this main consideration in this section of Scripture. If it's left behind, according to Solomon, what is the point? If I'm leaving this behind when I die, what's the point of accumulating it in the first place? People worry, of course, about our estates and the things that we leave to our children or grandchildren or those kinds of things. And Solomon says, sometimes we get so caught up in doing that we really focus in the wrong place. And that's kind of what Solomon's message is, that we are focused in the wrong place. 19 and 20 talks about would the one who received the inheritance be a complete fool? And of course, we know a little bit about that, don't we? What does history tell us about who received his inheritance? Well, they didn't in this case. When you're a king, you just give it to whomever you want to. So in this case, who got Solomon's inheritance? Rehoboam, right? And what do we know about Rehoboam? Guess what Rehoboam did with that inheritance? It took him less than a year to completely wipe out that kingdom. As you remember from your study of 1 Kings and Chronicles, that kingdom got split north and south, all because of Rehoboam and his foolishness. And so we can see that from that, Solomon was absolutely correct when he talks about who would the one who received the inheritance be a complete fool? The answer to that question we know from history as being a big fat yes. It absolutely, Rehoboam was a fool and did the wrong things. We do see an opposite process, of course, for us as Christians in the New Testament. We see in 1 Corinthians 15:58, therefore, my beloved brethren, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that your toil is not in vain in the Lord. So the shift here, of course, is that Solomon's toil, while he was certainly within the Lord because he was blessed by the Lord, but in this research project, his focus is only on worldly things. And so his resulting answer is that it's all vanity. Makes no sense to do these things if that is your focus. But Paul in 1 Corinthians tells us a little different thing for us, recognizing that if we do our work within the Lord, it's clearly not vanity and certainly not vain. So we know that our labors are storing up treasures in heaven as well. Matthew 6:19 and 20, do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, where thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourself treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in or steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And so we know from our study of the New Testament that the principles that Solomon's talking about were carried forward with a different twist. This twist has God involved. Solomon's twist had God not involved, at least for his research project. Verse 21. Questions? Comments? 21. When there is a man who has labored with wisdom, knowledge, and skill, then he gives his legacy to one who has not labored with them. This too is vanity. So Solomon here is saying he has to leave all of the works, all of the fruit that he has created to somebody else. And he has no control of that somebody else. Even though perhaps when he's alive, he might have control of that somebody else. Once he dies, He has no control. So that person can do whatever that person chooses to do regarding all of those works. And so Solomon says, why is a successful individual forced to leave his inheritance to an ingrate? Basically. And of course, that's what happened with Solomon. But once again, the focus here is on earthly accomplishments. It's an injustice to leave it to someone like this, to a foolish person. It's simply, in Solomon's viewpoint, better not to leave it at all. Not to leave it to anybody. And so the way you avoid that is not to accumulate all of this wealth in Solomon's viewpoint. Now, again, we're going to change that thought process pretty soon, but that's Solomon's, that's what he's thinking right now, based upon what he's found. Oh, Linda first, and then. Hey. Mm-hmm. Right.
All the hard work.
Right. Bill says that the key word here should be mentoring, that we should, as we grow and accumulate things, that we need to mentor those who are younger in order to transfer to them our thoughts and values, so that when we leave this inheritance, that they have those same thoughts and values. And Bill suggests that without that mentoring, we wind up in the scenario just like this. And so mentoring becomes very important to us. Linda. Yeah. Yep. Linda has 2 points. One to follow up from Bill, which she said her study with Dave Ramsey, financial guy, suggests the very same thing, to prepare those who you're going to leave an inheritance to, so that they don't squander what you have worked so hard for. And so she says that the Dave Ramsey program teaches that very idea. Second point she wanted to say was, when they first moved here, they purchased a house, and they did a lot of work from the exterior portion to make it really nice looking, and it was, in their view, very beautiful. But then they sold the house, and now they go back and look at this same house that was beautiful, and the people that have purchased it have trashed it, and all of the beautification things that they did to make it look nice, all gone. And so her point would be a follow-up to that, to say that this idea is exactly correct, because you never know what they're going to do. The person that takes over, you never know what they're going to do. And in this case, they just have made it worse, back to its ugly self as opposed to the pretty self. Marshall. Right. Yeah, Marshall says when we back up to 15 to understand a better definition of the word fool, that doesn't mean that the person necessarily is stupid and are unable to learn. They have just chosen not to. And so even though Solomon may have attempted to mentor, as Bill's word is, Rehoboam, it didn't work because, as Marshall points out, he chose not to pay any attention, and he just went his own way and did his own thing, and things got ugly quickly. All right. Okay, so back to 21. Why is it successful? I think we've finished that. I think there's a good lesson for this for us as Christians, and that simply would be to follow up with what already has been said, and that's not to leave our estates or our valuables to people who are foolish, not willing to learn. And I think that is a good reminder as well. Also a good reminder, and we certainly don't have time to go there, but if the 5th chapter of James is all about this. And so if you're interested in maybe doing a follow-up study, Chapter 5 of James would take you like 8 minutes to read or less, but it has a lot of powerful things in there that follow up with this very idea. So, encourage you to go there if you'd like. Verse 22 says, "For what does a man get in all his labor and in his striving, which he labors under the sun? Because all his days, his task is painful and grievous. Even at night, his mind does not rest. This too is vanity." So, we're going to leave it to somebody. Striving here, I think, is the exertion or effort in order to acquire wisdom. So the summary is that all labor and working for wisdom, in Solomon's view here, is vain, vanity, striving after the wind. And I think the above the above is true because there's never any real satisfaction to laboring and striving if one's focus is only on earthly things. So there's never really any real satisfaction from that other than we get initial satisfaction because we've completed something. And that's what Solomon has told us already, that he did find some satisfaction there. But as you think about your lives and your work, your job, things that happen to you individually, and you go to bed at night, and where does your mind go? It's always thinking about stuff most of the time, or a lot of the time, especially if you had a hard day at work, or there's been some negative interaction in your life from some form or another, from this earthly, worldly world that we live in. You go to bed and your mind is just running rampant on, why did this happen? Why did this do this? And it's hard to sometimes get to sleep. And unfortunately for us, some of us as elders, we experience that very same thing over some of the things that we're challenged with from overseeing the congregation. And we'll go home and many times we've sat in our meetings and say, man, I woke up at 2 o'clock and couldn't get back to sleep, because I'm thinking about this, what should we do? What should we do? And the anguish that goes through that kind of thing. So I can certainly relate to what Solomon is saying and how difficult this earthly life is for us. So, all right. 24 through 26. We've been working towards these verses, hoping that they would get here sooner than later. "There is nothing better for a man than to eat and to drink and to tell himself that his labor is good. This also I have seen, that it is from the hand of God. For who can eat and who can have enjoyment without him? For to a person who is good in his sight, he has given wisdom and knowledge and joy, while to the sinner he has given the task of gathering and collecting, so that he may give to one who is good in God's sight. This too is vanity and striving after the wind. We have made it to the turning point of Solomon's sermon. And it's a turning point where now Solomon is going to change his thoughts, and he is going to move us finally to focusing on God and not focusing on worldly things. And so this verse, the 24 through 26, is going to begin that process of now bringing us back to where he wanted us to be in the first place. He's been building, I think, to this climax, if you will. Just like when we first started, we said that, the Hebrew word here is for preacher, and we said this is just like a sermon. Well, he's doing the preacher thing, I think. He's intentionally led us, his audience, down the wrong road so that we might adopt a faulty conclusion. Then he gets to this verse, and now he's going to turn us and show that these conclusions are true only when we leave God out. So all of this has been to drag us along and make us suffer through these verses because they're difficult, because they are so negative, to finally bring us to the point where now he's going to switch us, and now we're going to focus on God. So one's entire viewpoint changes, of course, with God. Everything that he's mentioned is true without God, but with God, it changes. And so 3 reasons, I think, that we can identify that this is a major turning point. First, God is mentioned only once prior to this verse, verse 24, and that was in chapter 1, verse 13. And that particular time that it was mentioned, the reference was only to blame him for causing all of this trouble with man. Wasn't to honor him, wasn't to respect him, wasn't any of that. So I think that's one reason that we can see that, think at least that this is a turning point. Second, wisdom is now going to show an important piece. And we've been talking about his view of wisdom being vanity and striving after the wind, and David's comment about that kind of thing. So this negative view of wisdom and its worth is obviously presented to us throughout this first 2 chapters, if you will. But after this, he's going to show how important it is to have wisdom. And third, from this point forward, his words acknowledge the value of life. And up to this point, we haven't seen that. Typically, it's been very pessimistic, and we've talked about that. He seems to have seen nothing good in anything up until now. And so from this point forward, he is going to acknowledge the value of life on earth, even though up to this point it hasn't been very good. Solomon, we can change our little thing there with God. All is not vanity now, and we see that there. We also see Solomon's preaching technique. It's somewhat effective. He has us all convinced that he's really a downer, and that the things that he has to say is that we're just hopeless and we're lost and there's no value to life. And so, why do we even exist, and blah, 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 blah. But now we're going to switch that process, and he's going to show that there is goodness that needs to be thought about. Talks about eating and drinking in that verse, and that, of course, is equated with, I think, prosperity and enjoyment of life. and the things that God's provided, they're all worthwhile. Anything that God provides to us is worthwhile, and I think that's where Solomon's now trying to head us. And so, before this, and before Solomon brought this forward, we had this pessimistic viewpoint that makes sort of, we were saying, I want to throw my hands up in the air, and just give up because this has been so negative. But from this point on, I think we're going to see a different challenge. So, the reader, I think, will be encouraged to consider material things from the perspective that they have come from the hand of God and are His gifts to be enjoyed. And that's what we didn't have up to this point from Solomon. So, there's no true value to anything man does if he does it without considering God. And I think that's the basic concept that we're going to work from at this point. If material things brought happiness, surely Solomon would have been really happy because he had more than anybody. And we've sort of discussed that some in our previous studies, but his wealth and abundance was second to none. No one had as much as Solomon. So if these material things brought happiness, certainly he would have been happy, but clearly he was not. Remember what Jesus said from Luke. And he said to them, "Take heed and beware of covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of the things he possesses." So even here with Jesus, he's talking about the earthly things that we don't want to take for granted. We want to give God the glory and the blessings that God showers down upon us, not to take those for granted, and to make sure that we acknowledge that what we have, no matter how small it is, it's from God. And that's the focus that we're going to see from the rest of the book. So, without God, everything is vain, but with God's hand in our lives, we have the following things. And here's some of the things that Solomon is going to point out to us, and we'll look at as we go. First is the wisdom. Wisdom is good. We see that in verse 26. Life has enjoyment. Life has beauty, chapter 3, verse 11. Life has gifts, chapter 3, verse 13. Life has stability, chapter 3, verse 14. Life has purpose, chapter 3, verse 18. And life has joy despite hardship. So this is a complete turn, as we can see from where Solomon was, that negative, pessimistic, downer person, where now he's going to refocus us on God and how life is. We're blessed because of what God has done. So because of God, the perspective changes. Proverbs says, "In all your ways acknowledge Him, and He will make your paths straight." God must be our focus, and one man put it this way: without God, life is reduced to paychecks, weekends, and cheap thrills. And I think we can see that from our friends out in the world, that their lives, are centered around, what are we going to do this weekend? What are we going to do here or there? It's not centered on God. And so the idea that life with God becomes fulfilling and an enjoyment, I think is going to be prevalent as we continue this study. Of course, he's not talking about worldliness or materialism, but the proper view of materialism is that it's a blessing from God. So we have to remember that. Yeah. You certainly may.
Okay. A lot of times we get out and work. We look at God gives you everything. You didn't do it yourself. God made these things happen. And when you go out and you put 150% into that effort, then when you come home after you worked a hard day, you can sit down and say, I did this for my family, I did this for God, I did this for my wife. Now I can sit down and do it. A lot of people never find that.
Right.
Because they're struggling all the time, still trying to do it all themselves, trying to drag this big load back that they can never accomplish.
Right.
But you go out and do the very best you can for the Lord. Then when you sit down and do it, you can relax and know that everything's going to be work. Find that, you found a world of great. But if you don't find it, you're always going to struggle.
Right. So there's no way in the world that I can reiterate all that Bill said, but here's, I think, the gist of it. He's focused on verse 24 and how if we're focused on worldly things and not God, we're always going to be in this turmoil and not be have any peace. But when we focus on God and recognize that God provides the blessings to us in order to provide our jobs and provide all of those things that come to us from this life, and recognize that we wouldn't have it except for God, then when we come home from working a hard day's work and we sit down and have that recognition that we're blessed because of what God has done, then we can have peace and we can feel not only gratitude to God, but a comfort in knowing that we're fulfilling God's will. Get it? Okay. All right. Thank you.
Much better than what I did.
No. Okay, so let's quickly look at some attributes of wisdom. That, as we have said, he's been negative on wisdom, but he's going to change his ways. Because he was trapping us, he was tricking us, if you will, leading us down that preacher path to get us all going down this way, and then he throws us back in the right way. So here's a list of some benefits. It gives success in labor, prosperity, 2:21. It preserves life, 7:12. It protects us, 7:12. It helps in judgments, 7:23. It gives strength, 7:19 and 9:16. It gives joy, 8:1. It helps others, 9:15. And it gives success. So those are some attributes that now, after he's led us down this other path, he's going to, as we continue on through the book, we'll be seeing these and talking about them individually, but this is where he's going to take us. And this is his desire for us to see. All right, so knowledge in verse 26 equates to experience and ability. The Hebrew word that they've interpreted in our English Bible as knowledge is to experience and ability. Joy is the heartfelt peace and security that belongs to those in God. And so that should, as soon as we start talking about joy and peace and those kinds of things, should immediately take us to the New Testament, to this verse, rejoice in the Lord always. And again, I will say rejoice. Philippians 4:4. And so that's the message that Solomon's attempting to now cause us to go down. Some more concluding thoughts with 26. The sinner is the one whose focus is on himself. So the sinner's life, basically in this verse, says that he has no real value except that, And we've seen this in our study of the Old Testament and certainly the Kings, Chronicles, except that God uses the sinner to do good things for His people. And so we've seen that in our study, that God does in fact use that. Outside of this one positive thing, what the sinner does, according to Solomon, is vanity. The one positive point in this verse is that ultimately God is going to bless His people. So I found a few proverbs that help us, I think. 13:22, a good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children, and the wealth of the sinner is stored up for the righteous. 28:8, he who increases his wealth by interest and usury gathers it for him who is gracious to the poor. As sorrowful, yet always rejoicing, as poor, yet making many rich, as having nothing, yet possessing all things. And that, of course, is from the New Testament, from Paul. I think these verses help us to see what God's plan is. And while sinners, people outside the church, certainly can make lots and lots of money and have lots and lots of power, these verses indicate to us that they have that because God has blessed them to do that so that they can in turn help us in some way or another. Now, do I know what those ways are? Of course I don't. That's all in God's providential way of life, doing things basically behind the scene. And if you remember our study of providence, we know that God is working all of the time behind us, and most of the time we don't recognize what He's doing, but He's there doing something. And we may never know, or it might be years and years and years before we recognize, well, way back when, God did this, and now I have this. And so that's going to lead us into the most famous verse, or most famous chapter in all of Ecclesiastes, chapter 3. And all of you have heard this, read it, maybe studied it a little bit, but that's what we're going to do next week. So chapter 3, and if you have the ability to read through chapter 3, at least the first part of it, that's the most famous part. Very pretty poem stuff, but that's where we'll go next week. Thank you all for your comments and input. Certainly appreciate it, and your presence for today.